The most terrifying version of Galadriel is not the one who becomes dark, it is the one who remains beautiful. We all remember the scene: Lothlórien, silver leaves, Frodo offering her the ring. For a moment, the Lady of the Galadriel is transformed, not into something ugly, but into something terrible in its beauty. A queen, terrible as the dawn. All shall love her and despair. And then she passes the test. The light fades. I pass the test, she says. I will diminish and go into the west. We have always read this as a triumph. The moment the wisest of the elves proves that she is in fact wise. But what if her refusal was not just a triumph? What if it was the only thing that saved Middle-earth, not from Sauron, but from her? Because if Galadriel had taken the ring, she would not have become a second Dark Lord. She would not have covered the world in shadow. She would have done something far more dangerous. She would have won. Truly won. She would have brought peace, ended chaos, healed the wounds of the world. And she would have done it so completely that no one would remember how to be free. Sauron would enslave Middle-earth through fear. Galadriel would save it so perfectly that freedom itself would begin to feel like an illness. Would you call it evil if the world became safer, cleaner, calmer, more beautiful? Would you call it tyranny if everyone thanked her for it? The real horror of Galadriel with the ring is not that she would destroy Middle-earth. It is that she would become exactly the ruler most people would willingly choose.
The temptation everyone misunderstands.
Most people misunderstand the scene in Lothlórien. They see a moment of temptation, beautifully performed, quickly resolved. A noble elf briefly considers becoming something terrible and then thinks better of it. But in the Tolkien sense, this was not a moment. It was an ending. The final page of an internal history that had been writing itself for thousands of years. Galadriel was not always the ethereal figure we meet in The Lord of the Rings. In her youth, before the sun and moon, she was proud, ambitious. She dreamed of lands she could order according to her own will, dominions where she would answer to no one. The Silmarillion tells us she was strong, self-willed and proud. The ring would not need Galadriel to give her a new dream. It would only need to remove the limits from the one she already had. This is far more dangerous than simple corruption. A tyrant who decides to become evil is recognizable. You know what he is. But a ruler who from the beginning desired good, who wanted order, beauty, peace, and gradually lost the ability to tolerate anything that resisted that vision, that ruler is not a monster you can identify. That ruler is a solution you cannot refuse. Sauron wanted domination openly. Gandalf feared the ring precisely because he would use it for good. Galadriel stands in that same territory of dread. Her words, "All shall love me and despair," are not just a threat, they are a program of government. Everyone will love her because she will bring order. Everyone will love her because the war will end. Everyone will love her because the world will become more beautiful. And they will despair only when they realize that love for such a ruler leaves no room for anything else. This is exactly why she would be worse than a simple tyrant, because Galadriel with the ring would begin with restoration, and restoration is much harder to rebel against than terror. If Sauron was the obvious nightmare, Galadriel would be the beautiful one, and beautiful nightmares are harder to refuse.
Why she was so dangerous.
But this is where the story turns darker. Because to understand why she would be so dangerous, we have to ask not how powerful she was, but what kind of authority she carried. She carried a form of authority that Sauron could never imitate. Sauron ruled through fear, manipulation, degradation. But Galadriel belonged to the Calaquendi, the elves who had seen the light of the two trees before the world was darkened. She had walked in paradise. She remembered purity not as an idea, but as experience. When people looked at her, they did not see a ruler they feared. They saw someone they wanted to trust. She embodied a memory of goodness that made obedience feel like devotion, not surrender. She could rule without terror. Sauron's empire was structurally unstable because it rested on fear. Fear breeds resistance. But Galadriel could build something more durable, not because she was kinder, but because the free peoples would willingly gather around her. Aragorn, Elrond, Gandalf, the warriors of Rohan and Gondor, they would not look at her as a usurper. They would look at her as the last great hope. Sauron would force obedience. Galadriel would make obedience feel reasonable. And she understood power too well. This is the most important truth. Galadriel was not dangerous despite her wisdom. She was dangerous because of it. She understood temptation because she had lived with it for millennia. She understood the cost of failure because she had watched Feanor destroy himself. She would not be impulsive. She would not be theatrical. She would be effective. This is the part most people miss. Galadriel would not be dangerous because she was weak enough to fall. She would be dangerous because she was strong enough to seem right. The rim in her hand would not look like corruption at first. It would look like competence. And once power looks like competence, resistance becomes much harder. Cruelty invites rebellion. Competence invites consent. So if Galadriel took the ring, the first phase would not be horror, it would be relief.
The victory that feels like salvation.
Imagine that relief. The war that follows is not long, not grinding. It is fast, clean, almost shockingly decisive. With Galadriel at its head, the scattered forces of the free peoples are no longer scattered. Not because she terrifies them into obedience, but because beside her, division begins to look absurd. Decisions come faster, alliances form more easily, local ambitions grow quiet before a larger order. For the first time in centuries, everyone moves in the same rhythm. Sauron loses the initiative, not because he suddenly became weak, but because for the first time he faces an opponent who possesses not just power, but legitimacy, aura, and the will to focus everything in a single center. Isengard falls, not as a military campaign, but as a symbol, the end of old chaos. Rohan does not need to be conquered. It recognizes necessity. Gondor, long divided, becomes part of a new order. For a moment, Galadriel with the ring would look like proof that power really can be used wisely. But that is not the frightening part, because a war ending is not the same thing as freedom surviving. The battle would end there. The nightmare would not. The moment Galadriel wins the war is the moment the real story begins.
The first laws of the Golden Cage.
After victory, horror does not arrive immediately. What arrives is the administration of salvation, and everything sounds reasonable. Travel between regions begins to require permission, not because the queen is evil, but because the world has just emerged from war. Risk must be limited, movement must be monitored, peace must be protected. Weapons begin to be regulated, not because anyone wants to enslave the free peoples, but because the remnants of chaos cannot be allowed to return. Local rulers keep their titles, but their autonomy gradually becomes ceremonial. Not because anyone loves centralization, but because dispersed decisions were part of what made the old world weak. Every change is reasonable. Every change has moral justification. Every change is temporary. Every change seems necessary. And that is why no one protests. Tyranny does not always enter through fire. Sometimes it enters through policy. Galadriel would not forbid freedom in a single decree. She would create a world in which freedom increasingly seemed irresponsible. Irresponsible to travel without oversight. Irresponsible to keep weapons without registration. Irresponsible to make local decisions that might disrupt the larger harmony. Aragorn would feel it first, not as a rebel, but as someone who watches everything that sounds right become impossible to stop. Because beside her radiance, his own claim to kingship would begin to feel like a claim to something smaller, older, less necessary. Frodo would feel it too. He knows the weight of the ring. He recognizes a certain kind of silence. Not external silence, internal silence. The quiet that comes when people stop asking questions. He would recognize in the new piece the same atmosphere he felt while carrying the ring. The sense that things are being decided for him, not by him. Everyone else saw peace. Frodo felt pressure. And that is when the cage becomes invisible. Because the most effective chains are the ones people defend as necessary. Nothing looked broken yet. That was the problem. Galadriel would not ask the world to kneel. She would make kneeling feel like wisdom.
When the world stops being free.
Then comes the second phase. Galadriel does not want only safety. She wants preservation. She wants beauty to endure. She wants memory protected. She wants everything noble to never again yield to brutality, greed, and destruction. The problem is that when such a desire receives absolute power, it very easily stops tolerating everything that is alive, changeable, imperfect, and human. This is where nature enters, not as cheap apocalypse imagery, but as a system of values. The forests grow faster. Cities begin to be constrained by the new sanctity of landscape. Building, mining, expansion, trade, everything begins to be judged not by whether it serves people, but by whether it serves a vision of harmony. This is the key. Galadriel does not destroy humanity because she hates it. She simply stops regarding human freedom as the highest good. Bree is no longer just a town by the road. It becomes an example of what happens when the human world loses to the new sanctity of nature. The Shire is not burned or plundered. That would be too simple. The Shire is saved in a way that robs hobbits of the right to ordinariness. When the hobbits return home, they feel it immediately. There is no war, no smoke, no slaughter. There is peace, there is green, there is order. And that is why it hurts more. Their world was not killed. It was replaced by something higher, purer, more perfect, and completely foreign. The Shire would not be destroyed, it would be corrected. And once you extend that logic across the Fourth Age, the pattern becomes clear. People do not lose their lives, they lose historical agency. They are not murdered, they are displaced from the center of meaning. The world becomes more beautiful, calmer, and less theirs. Galadriel would not make ugliness triumphant, she would make beauty mandatory. And when beauty becomes mandatory, everything that does not fit the pattern, human messiness, accident, conflict, the ugliness of everyday life, imperfect growth, begins to be treated as a problem requiring correction. Under Sauron, you would know you were a slave. Under Galadriel, you might thank her for the cage. The world under Galadriel would not scream, it would go quiet. And one day no one would remember that silence was not the same thing as peace. This is the moment the ring truly wins, not because darkness returns, but because freedom becomes difficult to justify. The world is safer, the world is calmer, the world is no longer fully alive. Middle-earth would not fall into darkness, it would harden into perfection.
The real meaning of "I passed the test."
Return now to that scene in Lothlórien, to her words, to "I passed the test." This was not merely a personal moment of moral victory, it was an act of deeper wisdom than simply refusing temptation. Galadriel did not refuse the ring only because she feared becoming a monster. She refused it because she understood something more frightening, that she could take it, win, do everything better, and still betray the very idea of a free world. The true danger of the ring is not that it lets evil rule. It is that it can make domination look like wisdom. And that is why her refusal matters so much. She is not simply choosing good over evil. She is choosing an imperfect, risky, mortal, free world over a beautiful, safe, closed one. Galadriel with the ring would not be the darkest nightmare of Middle-earth. She would be the most convincing one. And that is why Tolkien had her refuse. Because sometimes the most moral thing you can do with absolute power is not use it at all. She did not save Middle-earth by taking the ring. She saved it by refusing to save it perfectly.